What stands out most about this Detroit Lions draft class is that this front office clearly stayed true to its identity. They did not chase headlines, they did not force flashy picks, and they did not try to win the draft on social media. Instead, they targeted players who fit exactly what this team needs right now, and maybe even more importantly, what this team wants to be for the next several years. When Greg Cosell breaks down a draft class, Lions fans pay attention. He has been doing this for Detroit for more than a decade, and his evaluations come directly from hours and hours of film study. He is not someone who throws around hype for no reason. So when he looks at this class and starts pointing out real traits that translate to Sundays, that matters. Let's start with first round pick Blake Miller out of Clemson, selected at number 17 overall. This is a move that tells you a lot about how Brad Holmes sees the future of this roster. Offensive line play has always been one of the foundations of this team, and Miller looks like another piece built for that identity. Cosell says Miller's 2025 tape showed a right tackle prospect who was at his best in one-on-one pass protection, especially with short sets and 45-degree sets. That is important because at the NFL level, surviving on an island against edge rushers is everything. He did mention that Miller had some struggles with vertical sets, where shaky body control and balance sometimes caused him to lean and overextend, which led to problems with maintaining a firm base. But here is the key part. Cosell kept watching, and the more he studied Miller in pass protection, the more convinced he became that he could be a quality starting right tackle at the next level. That is a big statement. He even compared the projection to San Francisco's Colton McKivitz, which gives fans a clear picture of the kind of dependable player Detroit may be getting. That should excite Lions fans because this is not about instant highlight plays. This is about protecting the quarterback, controlling games late, and keeping the offense stable for years. Then we move to the second round, and honestly, this may be one of the most intriguing picks of the entire class. Derek Moore out of Michigan at 44 overall. Cosell's evaluation here feels like exactly what Lions fans want to hear. He described Moore as an ascending edge prospect, someone whose best football may still be ahead of him. That matters because Detroit is not just drafting for today, they are drafting for what a player can become in 2 or 3 seasons. Moore's foundation is strength and power. He is built like an NFL edge defender, and according to Cosell, he plays like one too. His power shows up against the run and as a pass rusher. His speed to power conversion is one of his defining traits, and that is the kind of skill that translates immediately against pro offensive tackles. Even better, Cosell emphasized how consistently outstanding Moore was in the run game. He understands his responsibilities, uses his hands exceptionally well, and knows how to cross the face of offensive tackles to gain leverage inside. That is not just athleticism, that is disciplined football. On his 2025 tape, Moore continued to show that same power-based game, but with even stronger hand usage and precise placement to break down offensive tackles and drive them back into the pocket. That is exactly the type of disruptive presence Detroit has wanted more of. And here is where it gets even more interesting. Cosell believes Moore can fit in either a base 4-3 front or a base 5-2 front, while also being deployed as a sub-package pass rusher both off the edge and sometimes inside. That kind of versatility is extremely valuable because it gives the defensive staff options. You are not drafting a one-role player, you are drafting a weapon. This feels like one of those picks Lions fans could look back on and say, that was the moment they found another major defensive building block. Then in round 4, Detroit added linebacker Jimmy Rolder from Michigan, and this is the kind of selection that often gets overlooked on draft weekend, but becomes very important once the season starts. Cosell described Rolder as a consistent and savvy stacked linebacker who plays with control, calculation, and good eyes. That sounds exactly like the kind of linebacker coaches trust quickly. He keys and diagnoses plays well, triggers fast in the box, and can work through traffic efficiently to make tackles. That ability to stay disciplined while navigating traffic is something you cannot teach easily. It shows up especially against strong run teams, and Detroit knows how important that is in the NFC. Rolder was mostly used as a stacked linebacker in Michigan's defense, but Cosell also pointed out that he was deployed as a second-level rusher in multiple stunt concepts, both as a penetrator and a looper. He was also featured in 5-man zone pressures and 4-man simulated pressures. That tells you he brings more than just standard linebacker play. He offers flexibility, and defensive coordinators love players who can create disguise and confusion for opposing offenses. And the deeper you look at this class, the clearer the strategy becomes. Detroit is not drafting names. They are drafting functions. Every player has a purpose. The Lions are building something very specific here, and through these first 3 major evaluations, it feels like Brad Holmes once again trusted the board, trusted the film, and trusted the identity of this roster rather than outside noise. And honestly, that might be the smartest move of all. Because if Blake Miller becomes that steady starter on the offensive line, if Derek Moore develops into that power edge defender with inside-out versatility, and if Jimmy Rolder becomes one of those dependable linebackers who quietly makes everything work, this draft could end up being much bigger than people realize right now. But there are still more names in this class that deserve attention, especially one defensive back that could quietly become a very important piece in the secondary. Do you think Derek Moore has the best chance to become the biggest impact player from this draft class? And that is where this draft class gets even more interesting, because some of the later round selections might end up becoming some of the smartest value picks Detroit made all weekend. When people look back at strong draft classes, it is rarely just about the first round pick. It is about finding contributors on day 3, players who were not expected to carry major headlines but ended up becoming trusted pieces of the roster. That is exactly why the selections of Keith Abney II and the overall structure of this class deserve more attention. Let's talk about Keith Abney II, the cornerback out of Arizona State, selected in round 5 at number 157 overall. This is the kind of pick that can quietly turn into a major win if developed correctly. Greg Cosell pointed out the main question immediately when evaluating Abney's 2025 tape. Is he an outside corner or a slot corner at the next level? That question matters because projection is everything for defensive backs entering the NFL. A player can be productive in college, but the transition depends heavily on where he fits best physically and technically. According to Cosell, the concern with Abney on the outside comes down to length and top-end speed. He does not have the ideal arm length or the pure vertical speed teams often want from boundary corners who are asked to match up against bigger and faster receivers every week. That can make life difficult on the outside in the NFL, where mistakes get punished immediately. But here's the important part. Cosell does not see that as a weakness that limits his future. Instead, he sees it as a reason to project him as a slot corner, and that could be where Detroit found real value. His overall tape was strong in both press man and zone coverage, and Cosell believes he has the traits needed to become an effective slot corner at the next level. That should absolutely catch the attention of Lions fans because the modern NFL asks a lot from slot defenders. They are not just covering underneath routes anymore. They have to handle quick releases, motion, crossing concept, run support responsibilities, and often some of the smartest route runners on the field. A good slot corner is incredibly valuable, and if Detroit believes Abney can grow into that role, this is not just a depth pick. This could be a real future contributor in the secondary. And when you step back and look at the entire class together, the pattern becomes obvious. Blake Miller brings stability and long-term value at right tackle. Derek Moore brings power, physicality, and pass rush upside on the defensive front. Jimmy Rolder brings intelligence, discipline, and versatility at linebacker. Keith Abney II brings developmental upside and potential value in the slot at corner. This is not random. This is roster construction with purpose. Brad Holmes and this front office continue to show that they are not drafting based on panic or short-term reaction. They are drafting based on sustainability. They are looking at where this roster needs to stay strong, where future contracts will force tough decisions, and where depth today can become starters tomorrow. That is how winning organizations stay competitive, and honestly, that might be the most impressive part of all this. Detroit is no longer drafting like a team trying to escape rebuilding mode. They are drafting like a team trying to stay in championship contention. That is a completely different mindset. You are not just looking for talent, you are looking for fit, reliability, versatility, and players who can survive the pressure of meaningful football in January. Cosell's breakdown suggests Detroit may have found exactly that. Of course, none of this is guaranteed. Every draft class looks promising in April. The real answers come in training camp, preseason battles, and eventually on Sundays when these players have to prove it against NFL competition. But what makes this class feel different is how clearly the plan shows itself. There is logic behind every selection. There is a role attached to every name. That should give Lions fans confidence, because the best drafts are not always the loudest ones. Sometimes the best drafts are the ones where 2 years later, fans realize the team quietly solved multiple future problems before they even became problems. That might be what happened here. If Blake Miller locks down the right side of the line, if Derek Moore becomes a disruptive force in the front seven, if Jimmy Rolder turns into a dependable linebacker rotation piece, and if Keith Abney II becomes a trusted slot defender, then this class will be remembered as another example of Detroit getting it right when it mattered most. And for a franchise trying to push from contender to true Super Bowl threat, that is exactly what this offseason needed. And there is one more layer to this entire draft conversation that should not be ignored, because it says a lot about where the Detroit Lions believe this team is heading next. This front office is clearly preparing for sustained success, not just one playoff run. That distinction matters. A lot of teams draft with urgency because they are trying to fix immediate problems. Detroit is drafting with confidence because they believe the foundation is already strong. They are not desperate for stars at every position. They are focused on reinforcing the structure that keeps championship windows open. That is why a player like Blake Miller makes so much sense. When you already have a competitive roster, protecting the offensive line becomes even more important. Games in January are often decided by physical control at the line of scrimmage. If Miller develops into the dependable right tackle Greg Cosell believes he can be, that is not just a solid pick. That is a move that protects the entire offense for years. The same goes for Derek Moore. Elite teams do not stop investing in pass rushers. They keep adding them. They understand that pressure changes everything. Moore's power-based game, his ability against the run, and his versatility to rush both outside and inside give Detroit the kind of rotational strength that matters deep into a season. And what stands out most is that Cosell did not describe him as a finished product. He described him as ascending. That should be exciting, because if Moore is already winning with strength, speed to power, and advanced hand usage, what happens when his pass rush arsenal becomes even more refined at the NFL level? That is where real difference makers are created. Then there is Jimmy Rolder, and honestly, players like him often become fan favorites faster than expected. Why? Because fans notice reliability. They notice the linebacker who is always in the right spot. They notice the player who handles traffic well, diagnoses quickly, and makes the tackle before a 5-yard gain turns into 15. Those players may not always dominate highlight reels, but coaches trust them and winning teams depend on them. Cosell's description of Rolder as savvy, controlled, and calculated sounds like someone who could earn that trust quickly, and Keith Abney II might be the hidden conversation here. Every year there is at least one later round defensive back who surprises people, because the projection was better than the public realized. If Detroit truly sees him as a slot defender and develops him in that role, that could end up being one of those picks fans look back on and say, how did he last until round 5? Because the slot is no longer a secondary role in today's NFL. It is a starting job with major responsibility. The best part of all of this is that none of these picks feel disconnected from the identity of the team. This still looks like a Dan Campbell football team. Physical, disciplined, tough in the trenches, smart in the details, versatile on defense. That consistency matters because it means the coaching staff and front office are still aligned. When that happens, development becomes smoother, competition becomes healthier, and young players have a much better chance to succeed. That is one of the biggest reasons Detroit has changed as an organization.